In the late 19th century, the south shore of Lake Erie was becoming a destination vacation spot. There was one peninsula in Ohio that was known for its fishing and had some army barracks built upon it. But in 1870, the German immigrant businessman Louis Zistel built some bathhouses and a beer garden on the North Shore and charged 25 cents for a ferry to the peninsula. The amusement world would never be the same. The peninsula's attractions were popular, and in 1888, the owners of Cedar Point would open a Grand Pavilion. The Grand Pavilion was a two-story theater and a concert hall. It also featured a bowling alley and a photographer's studio. The building was recognized for having unusual architecture and was very successful and popular. It brought many people to the park, enough that in 1890, the park's first ever amusement ride would open. This ride was a water toboggan ride that included a ramp that launched riders into Lake Erie. The ride was very successful, and in the following year, electricity was provided to the peninsula for the first time. Then, in 1892, the park made a decision that would set it on a course to become the greatest amusement park in the world. It opened its first roller coaster that would be the first in a line of many. It was called Switchback Railway. It stood 25 feet high and had a top speed of only 10 miles per hour. The Switchback Railway had an interesting design of two identical tracks side by side, one for a thrilling ride down and the other one for the train to be hauled back to the top by the ride attendant. The ride featured no lift or launch mechanism and was completely operated by the ride attendants. It was a very primitive roller coaster, but it was super important for the park's history. The ride was very successful, charging only 5 cents to ride, and there were reports of riders sometimes waiting 3 hours to get on the new roller coaster. As you can see, this ride attracted lots of people to the park and was a crazy attraction for the time. The resort was popular enough that in 1897, representatives of the Lake Erie and Western Railroad purchased the resort. They purchased it for $256,000 US, which today would be worth over $8 million. George A. Boakling, who was a businessman from Indiana, was chosen to be the park's new manager. His time in charge of the park transformed the peninsula from a picnic ground into a nationally recognized amusement destination. In 1902, he would open the second roller coaster at Cedar Point, titled the Figure 8 Roller Toboggan. It was another successful addition for the park, a basic figure-8 wooden roller coaster. The same year, a pony track was built near the beach. Those additions kept the park going well, and in 1905, the historic Hotel Breakers opened as one of the largest hotels in the Midwest. It had 600 guest rooms and a cafe that could seat 400 guests. It was very popular and still stands on the same site today. In 1908, the Dip the Dip Scenic Railway roller coaster opened. This was a basic scenic railway type of roller coaster, and it was overshadowed by the larger Leap the Dips ride that would open in 1912. Dip the Dips was closed in 1970 and replaced by the Leapfrog Scenic Railway. The park was thriving, and several more hotels and restaurants were constructed. Cedar Point continued to update its attractions, replacing a few rides to make way for the Shoot the Chutes water ride, a tilt-a-whirl, and some fun houses. In 1929, Cedar Point would open their biggest coaster yet, a rough and rickety wooden coaster called the Cyclone. The ride was very popular and successful. However, George Boekling, the owner of the park, died on July 24th, 1931. Edward Smith was hired as the new manager. However, throughout the 1930s, there was little expansion due to the Great Depression. The decaying Leap the Dips coaster was demolished in the mid-1930s. However, the second floor of the Coliseum was modernized in an Art Deco style. The giant dance floor remained and some of the top bands of the time played. As a result, it is credited with keeping Cedar Point operating throughout the rest of the Depression. So when the next time you go to Cedar Point, you can thank the Coliseum for keeping this park open. However, the resort was still in very poor condition. By the end of World War II, Cedar Point was in need of a lot of help. The wood on the Cyclone roller coaster was rotting. The fishing dock was in need of repair, and the boardwalk was cracked in many places. In 1946, the Midway Carousel was built, which still exists at Cedar Point to this day. But in 1951, the Cyclone roller coaster was raised because of its poor condition, leaving the resort without a roller coaster. The times look hopeless for Cedar Point. What could happen to this once great amusement pier? Find out in the next episode. As the Cyclone coaster was demolished, 3 new rides were built in its place: the Laugh in the Dark, the Rocket Ships, and the Lupa-Plane. But these were nothing compared to the modifications that would be made to the park in 1959. In 1959, the park made additions that would cost over $1,200,000, which today would be worth over $11 million. These additions included repainting the hotels, adding new admission gates, and just general money spent to refresh Cedar Point. And the park's first ever roller coaster since the Cyclone was built. This coaster would be Wild Mouse. Wild Mouse was a BA Schiff large Wild Mouse. It had 1,300 feet of track and lasted a minute and 20 seconds. The ride utilized a design with steel track on wooden supports, which was very interesting for the time. The ride was very important for Cedar Point, but it actually wasn't the most popular ride at the park in 1959. The park would also get a new kind of ride, which was a monorail. The monorail was a suspended monorail that had been moved from a park in Akron, where it was tested but never opened to the public. This monorail was the first of its kind in America, and it was very popular and successful for the park. The 1959 additions also included remodelings for Hotel Breakers, the Coliseum, and the Grand Pavilion. The latter of the two were also repainted. The Crystal Rock maintenance shop, the bathhouses, and the old powerhouse were all demolished, and a new $50,000 structure that contained bathhouses, a boiler house, and a maintenance shop was built in their place. In the 1960s, with the idea of pay-one-price season passes becoming common, Cedar Point announced that they had plans to transform the park into a Disneyland. However, those plans would fall through. In 1963, Cedar Point would open the Cedar Point and Lake Erie Railroad. This is a railroad train ride that would transport passengers from the middle of the park all the way to the back. This was a popular ride, and it still exists today. And in 1964, Cedar Point would build a roller coaster that at the time was a typical wooden coaster. However, this wooden coaster still exists at Cedar Point today and is known as Blue Streak. It was named after the local high school sports team, the Sandusky Blue Streaks. This would be a 78-foot high PTC wooden coaster that would travel at 40 miles per hour and have 2,558 feet of track. It was a popular ride for the park and still exists today as the park's oldest surviving roller coaster. In 1969, Cedar Point would open the Cedar Creek Mine Ride. This was an Aero mine train coaster and is currently the second oldest roller coaster at Cedar Point as it still exists. Then, the following year, the Centennial Theater would open. It was named in honor of Cedar Point's 100th anniversary. This theater would be used for stage shows and other entertainment to attract more and more people to the park. These rebuilding efforts made the park very successful. The park made a lot of money, and in 1976, Cedar Point would open a roller coaster that would change the peninsula's attraction legacy forever. Former park general manager John Hildebrandt would say, "It was the fifth coaster, which opened in 1976, that changed everything forever at Cedar Point." What would this new record-breaking coaster be? Find out in the next episode. In 1976, Cedar Point would build Corkscrew. Corkscrew was an Aero corkscrew coaster that was 85 feet tall, 2,050 feet long, and 48 miles per hour speed. It had 3 inversions, 2 of Aero's signature corkscrews, as well as Aero's first vertical loop. It almost had the world's first vertical loop, but was beat to the punch by Magic Mountain's Revolution. The ride's signature corkscrew would span over midway, and it would be one of the first ever coasters to do that. The ride costed $1,750,000 and was very popular for the park. The new corkscrew coaster, which was the first ever to have 3 inversions, drew many people to Cedar Point. Cedar Point made a lot of money off of corkscrew. Enough that just 2 years later, Cedar Point would build the world's tallest, fastest, and steepest roller coaster. This roller coaster was Gemini. It was a racing aero coaster that was essentially a very large mine train. Gemini featured 2 separate tracks, the red track and the blue track. Each track was 3,935 feet long. The height of the coaster was 125 feet with a 118-foot drop, and the coaster would travel 60 miles per hour, reaching a drop angle of 55 degrees, which at the time was the world's steepest coaster. The ride's main feature, which drew so many people to the ride, was its dueling factor. This meant that 2 trains were dispatched at a time to race through the course. There are some parts of the roller coaster where the trains get so close that people will attempt to high-five people on the other train. The ride was very reliable and was extremely popular and very successful, as it still exists today as one of the park's most popular coasters. The following year, Cedar Point would open Gemini's little brother, Junior Gemini, right across from Gemini on the Gemini Midway. This is another old coaster that still exists, now known as Wilderness Run. A fun fact is that the Junior Gemini Kiddie Coaster was actually the first coaster ever built by Intamin, who would later go on to build Millennium Force and Top Thrill Dragster for the park, 2 amazing and record-breaking coasters. In 1982, Cedar Point would open a new log flume ride called Whitewater Landing. This would replace the original Shoot the Rapids log flume. In 1983, a new ride would be placed at the very front of the park. This ride was an Intamin freefall that would be 131 feet tall and would drop you straight down 60 feet, reaching a speed of 55 miles per hour. This was one of the first ever drop tower style rides, and it was extremely popular throughout its entire run. 2 years later, the park would open yet another popular roller coaster. This roller coaster would be called Avalanche Run. Avalanche Run was a 63-foot tall bobsled coaster with just under 2,000 feet of track. It would reach speeds of 40 miles per hour. Avalanche Run was a popular bobsled coaster, and that same year, the San Francisco Earthquake Ride was transformed into the Berenstein Bear Country. In 1986, Cedar Point would receive a new CEO of the park, Dick Kinzel. Kinzel would be president and CEO of Cedar Fair right until 2012, with a very successful run in charge of the park. That same year, Cedar Point would open a new river rafting ride called Thunder Canyon. The next year, Cedar Point would open a new roller coaster, which was going to be an arrow swinging suspended roller coaster. This roller coaster was called Iron Dragon, and you can still ride it today under that same name. Iron Dragon would be 2,800 feet long, with a height of 76 feet, reaching speeds of 40 miles per hour. This coaster was a little bit tamer than some of Cedar Point's other coasters, but it served as a good family coaster, which it still does today. The swinging suspended coaster was still a relatively new concept when it was built, so it was very exciting for the park to have a coaster where the cars ran under the track rather than on top of it like traditional roller coasters. Iron Dragon was popular, and in 1988, Cedar Point would construct a whole nother part of the park called Soak City. Soak City was Cedar Point's outdoor water park, and it was constructed near Hotel Breakers. It featured many speed slides, more than 10 body and tube slides, a family raft ride, a water playhouse, and 2 brand new lazy rivers. This new water park was very popular, and Cedar Point continued to thrive, but in 1989, Cedar Point would do something that would change the way roller coasters were built forever. What would this new move be? Find out in the next episode. In 1989, Magnum XL-200 debuted. Magnum XL-200 was a new steel roller coaster built by Aerodynamics. Magnum XL-200 was the world's tallest and fastest roller coaster, and it was the first roller coaster to exceed a height of 200 feet. This made it the first ever hypercoaster in the world, which was a new classification of roller coasters that was invented to classify roller coasters that were 200 feet or more in height. The ride was 205 feet tall with a 195-foot drop. The ride would travel 72 miles per hour and reach a 60-degree vertical angle. It utilized 5,106 feet of track. The coaster changed the world forever. It kicked off the Coaster Wars, which was a period of time when many huge parks were scrambling to build the world's tallest roller coasters, with the height record and other records being broken regularly. The roller coaster made a huge difference for Cedar Point's importance, and in 1990, Avalanche Run would be rethemed into a whole new ride. The ride was transformed into a new ride called Disaster Transport. It was fully enclosed, and many special effects and new theming was added. However, in the following years, many of the special effects and theming were removed, leaving the ride almost completely in the dark. The following year, Cedar Point would make an even bigger project. This project would be so big that it would be the world's tallest and fastest wooden coaster. This coaster was called Mean Street. It was a din-built wooden coaster that had 65 miles per hour speed and a height of 161 feet. The roller coaster was very popular and would stay at Cedar Point for many years as a very popular wooden coaster. However, it did grow to be very rough in its later years. The next year, Cedar Point would construct a brand new section of the park called Challenge Park. Challenge Park was a free admission section of the park that included some upcharge attractions like Ripcord, a sky coaster, and some mini golf courses. It was built in between Hotel Breakers and Soak City. I could go into a whole nother video about Challenge Park, so I won't go super in detail on the history of it, but it was very successful until its closure. In 1993, Cedar Point would build yet another water ride called Snake River Falls. It was an 82-foot tall shoot-the-chutes ride that featured a 50-degree drop with a huge splash at the bottom of the ride. I've been on this ride, and I can tell you it's quite a lot of fun. Then, in 1994, Cedar Point would build yet another popular steel coaster. This would be Cedar Point's first ever coaster, built by Swiss manufacturers Bolliger and Mabillard. Bolliger and Mabillard would construct one of their famous inverted coasters called Raptor. Calypso was a flat ride that was removed to make room for Raptor, which was the first ever inverted roller coaster to feature a cobra roll. Raptor would feature 6 unique inversions, as well as over 3,000 feet of track, 137 feet of height, and it would travel at 57 miles per hour. Raptor was a very impressive coaster, but 2 years later, Cedar Point would open yet another Bolliger and Mabillard coaster. This coaster would be a stand-up coaster, the tallest, steepest, and fastest in the world. This roller coaster was called Mantis. It was originally supposed to be called Banshee, but it was changed after the public thought that name was too dark. The name would later be used for an inverted coaster at Kings Island. Mantis was 145 feet tall and just under 4,000 feet long. It was very successful for the park, as stand-up coasters were very popular at that time, and everybody wanted to get on the biggest one. In 1997, the park would introduce a new event called Halloweekends. Halloweekends was an event that would take place in September and October. It would feature the park's signature roller coasters, as well as many haunted houses and mazes, which can only be experienced during the event. You can still experience Halloweekends today during that same time frame. In 1999, Cedar Point would debut a whole new themed area called Camp Snoopy. It would feature 8 Snoopy-themed attractions, including a new junior roller coaster called Woodstock Express. This themed area would also include retheming the Junior Gemini to Wilderness Run. Following year, 2000, Cedar Point would do something that no park had ever done before. They would introduce a brand new classification of coaster that was above Hypercoaster. This coaster consisted of coasters who had a height or drop of over 300 feet, the Giga coaster. Cedar Point would build the world's first Giga coaster called Millennium Force in 2000. It sat 310 feet above the ground and had a 300-foot drop and would reach speeds of up to 93 miles per hour. Millennium Force changed the world. There are still a limited number of Giga coasters across the world, but each and every one of them are amazing rides. In 2002, Cedar Point would introduce the world's tallest inverted coaster, Wicked Twister. Wicked Twister was a launched impulse roller coaster, which was a sort of shuttle coaster. Riders go up and back down a twisted spike after a multi-pass launch. On typical impulse coasters, the riders would then go up a straight spike, but Wicked Twister introduced a second twisted spike for twisting on both ends. Twisters was very successful, and 2003 would see the construction of yet another record-breaking roller coaster. This a roller coaster that would yet again claim the records for height and speed. This roller coaster was built by Intamin, and it was called Top Thrill Dragster. Top Thrill Dragster was 420 feet high, making it the world's first Stratacoaster, a coaster over 400 feet. It would also reach a maximum speed of 120 miles per hour, making it the world's fastest coaster. However, its records would be broken 2 years later by King Dakar at Six Flags Great Adventure, which still holds the records. In 2005, Cedar Point would debut Max Air, which was the second Huss giant frisbee ride in the United States. It was built after the success of a similar ride, Delirium, at Kings Island. In 2006, Cedar Point would continue to build up their flat ride collection by building Skyhawk. Skyhawk was an S&S Screamin' Swing, which is basically a gigantic pneumatically powered playground swing. It has some very good airtime and forces and is a very enjoyable ride. And in 2007, Cedar Point would introduce a new roller coaster that would set Cedar Point on a different direction. This roller coaster would put an end to the coaster wars and make parks start to choose quality of rides over records and quantity. What was this new roller coaster? Watch the next episode to find out. In 2007, Cedar Point would build Maverick, the world's first ever intimate blitz coaster. Maverick was a world-changing coaster. Its stats were meager, having only 105 feet of height and traveling at 70 miles per hour. It definitely wasn't the world's tallest or fastest coaster, but it was an amazing ride. Because of Cedar Point's decision to go with a smaller ride with a great experience, other parks started to do the same thing, leading the industry to start moving more towards good coasters than just lots of stats like it had been doing during the coaster wars. This is why people say Maverick is the roller coaster that put an end to the coaster wars. In 2008, Cedar Point would introduce Planet Snoopy, which was a new kids area that was built on the site of the former Peanuts playground. Planet Snoopy consisted of family and children's rides, all of them relocated from Cedar Point's sister park Giga Lake, which had the year before been closed. The area also included a restaurant, and in 2009, Cedar Point would debut the Starlight Experience, which was a nighttime light extravaganza show with floats themed to the Four Seasons. The attraction costed $1 million and would take place on the Frontier Trail. The year after, Cedar Point would continue to invest in the Frontier Trail with a new water ride called Shoot the Rapids. Shoot the Rapids had 2 drops and lasted 3 minutes through its Western-themed environment. However, it was removed in 2016 following a 2013 incident injuring 7 riders. In 2011, Cedar Point would build a 300-foot swing ride called Windseeker, as well as getting a new CEO. Dick Kinzel retired on June 20th in 2011, and Matt Ouimet would become the CEO of the company. He had been employed by Walt Disney Company for 17 years, including 10 years as president of Disney Cruise Line and the Disneyland Resort. In 2012, Cedar Point would add Dinosaurs Alive, which was a walkthrough exhibit featuring many animatronic dinosaurs. Dinosaurs Alive was replaced with Forbidden Frontier after the 2018 season. Also in 2012, Cedar Point would announce the removal of Disaster Transport and Space Spiral, 2 popular rides on the beach. Then, 1 month later, Cedar Point would announce Gatekeeper. Gatekeeper was a new kind of roller coaster called a wing coaster, where riders rode on trains that had seats on either side of the track. Gatekeeper traveled directly over Cedar Point's front gate through 2 keyholes above the building. Gatekeeper was 170 feet high, traveled at 67 miles per hour, and had a track length of over 4,000 feet. Gatekeeper was very successful, and in 2014, Cedar Point would add a couple new family attractions to the Gemini Midway called Pipe Scream and Lake Erie Eagles. They would also add a pay-per-ride thrill ride called Slingshot. In 2015, Cedar Point would change Mantis by transforming it into a floorless roller coaster with new trains. The new roller coaster would receive a new color scheme and a new name, being called Rougarou. The same year, Hotel Breakers would receive a $25 million renovation. The next year, Cedar Point would again break more records by debuting Valraven, the tallest, fastest, and longest dive coaster in the world. The 223-foot tall ride would bring you up to its max height and then teeter you over the top before dropping you down. Cedar Point's Valraven was a very successful dive coaster, but as 2016 ended, Cedar Point announced that they would be tearing down Mean Streak. Mean Streak was a very popular and large wooden coaster, and in August of 2017, Cedar Point officially announced that Mean Streak would not be torn down like previously thought. Instead, it would reemerge as a whole new roller coaster called Steel Vengeance. Steel Vengeance was a roller coaster that was designed by Rocky Mountain Construction using their hybrid coaster technology. This meant that Steel Vengeance would be a completely different ride from Mean Streak, featuring steel track rather than the wood track that Mean Streak had. Steel Vengeance would be much taller than Mean Streak at 205 feet tall, featuring a 200-foot drop, making it the world's first hybrid coaster to also be a hypercoaster, or a coaster over 200 feet. Steel Vengeance would be 5,740 feet long, which was over 300 feet longer than Mean Streak had been, mostly because a lot of the elements were much taller than Mean Streak's elements were. The coaster would open in 2018 to rave reviews, with many calling it the greatest coaster in the world. It's certainly my favorite coaster out of any that I've ridden. It's a very good ride. However, just 3 years later, in 2021, something would happen on the park's popular Top Thrill Dragster roller coaster. A piece would fly off of the train, striking a guest in line, resulting in the guest's hospitalization. The ride has not yet reopened, and much of the launch track has been torn out and removed. However, Cedar Point has confirmed that a new and reimagined ride experience will be coming to Cedar Point, replacing Top Thrill Dragster. What will it be? We'll just have to wait and see, find out. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching this whole project and sticking through it with me. This has been a really fun project to create, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching it just as much. If you guys have any parks or other things that you think you want me to make a history video about, just let me know, as I really enjoyed making this content and form of video. As always, make sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for great coaster content just like this. As always, thanks for watching. CZ Coasters, signing off.